Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have three amazing guests to introduce to you now. Alison Morgan holds a degree in agriculture from the University of Reading and a postgraduate degree in global development. She has enjoyed 40 years working with arable and livestock farmers in agriculture research, farm adversary work, and farming, food, and environmental policy roles. She has also worked overseas with farmers and pastoral herders in Central Asia and the Middle East. Anita Tagore has a degree in medicine from the University of Cambridge. She is a former GP and completed recently a master's degree in food and human nutrition. Anita has spent the last 5 years researching and writing about the benefits of an animal-based diet. Dave Ellis graduated in earth sciences from the University of Cambridge. He spent 35 years in the oil industry as a geophysicist searching for oil and gas. He is now appreciating the ways that farming can aggravate or alleviate climate change. The three of them are the authors of the recent and excellent book, Why Vegans Have Smaller Brains and How Cows Reverse Climate Change. This groundbreaking book reveals why plant-based eating is not only harming human health, it is also harming the planet. Dave, Anita, and Alison, what an honor just to welcome all three of you to Boundless Body Radio.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Be here. Thank you.
Such an honor to host you guys. I absolutely love your book. It was one of our book club books for Dr. Chafee's book club, which I am a part of. We had an excellent time discussing the content of the book. Everybody found it very captivating and riveting, and we had some really, really good discussions around there. And you were kind enough to also appear and answer questions from that group of lovely people. The first question that I think everybody has for you is always the same. How did you land on such a provocative title? It is such a good title.
That's yours.
Well, there's truth to the title, but originally it was a friend who came up with the title. I was telling him about studies that I'd come across, which showed that the lower the amount of vitamin B12 in your diet, the more your brain shrinks with age. And at the other end of the spectrum, there are studies on babies who've been breastfed by vegan or vegetarian mothers who actually can suffer severe brain atrophy sometimes. And this brain atrophy can be completely reversed if you administer vitamin B12, but only if it's done in time within the first 6 to 12 months of life. So there's complete truth to the title of the book. That's the first half of the title. And the second half is Ali's remit. And that's true as well. I'll let her tell you about it when we come to that.
Yes. Do you want, so it's how cows reverse climate change. And so the latter part of the book is about farming and the environment, and one part of that is the claim that cows cause climate change by emitting methane, why that isn't true, and also on the other side of things, why crop farming is actually much more damaging to the planet in so many ways.
Yeah. So we didn't want to have so two provocative parts of the title. We we didn't want to have just a diet book. I mean, so many times you read stories in the media, online, and so on. I mean, diet books all over the place that tell you about, claim these health benefits or whatever, but they don't pay any attention to how that food is farmed. And likewise, you see farming studies or environmental studies about farming that make claims that this is good or this is bad, but don't really appreciate how those choices that you might make in farming would then feed through into diet. So we wanted to have a book that addressed both sides of that equation.
Well, you do such a great job in capturing that. So I'm glad that was the goal, and it certainly came through in the book. I was telling you offline that I recently got back from Dave Feldman's conference that he hosts in Las Vegas, Nevada, the COSI 2025 conference, where we reviewed some of the latest research on cholesterol and the metabolic psychiatry that's on the rise, which is great. And as part of the conference, he hosted a debate that went on for an hour and 20 minutes, I believe, between Dr. Peter Ballerstedt, who we've hosted plenty of times on the show, and a vegan. And tons of respect to the vegan who showed up to a largely pro, carnivore type audience to be able to talk and try to make counterpoints. And I tried to be as open-minded as possible to listen to him and the points that he was making. But it's so hard to defend veganism. They just end up like running in circles and confusing different things and bringing up different numbers that don't really seem logically that accurate. And it feels like we spend so much time defending, the raising of cattle and the consumption of animals in our diets, where what you guys do in the book so well is you actually attack the other side and say, like, well, maybe we should go on the offensive and say how bad eating plants is and how bad raising plants is. And I think you guys capture that so very well. So kudos there to be able to do that.
Great.
I'd say that the main aims of the book are to present correct evidence-based information to help people. The aim is not to offend.
Sure. You guys make that point early on in the book to say, like, we're not picking on vegans. We chose the title to be provocative. We have evidence that we're going to present, and it's pretty strong evidence, but it's not an attack on the way that anybody wants to approach life and eat whatever they want, which I really appreciate as well. Before we get into some of the content of the book, it strikes me that the three of you must have had three pretty amazing stories. You also write about that in the book. Can you tell us each briefly how you kind of arrived at where you are today and how you look at plant-based diets versus animal-based diets?
Well, I've been passionate about food, diet, and health ever since I was a teenager. I've been looking into different diets for many decades. But this book actually started with a patient that I saw who'd come to see me because she'd been found to have a high blood cholesterol level. And the standard thinking, obviously, was to start her on treatment for it, which she declined. And she said to me she would bring a book to tell me why she was declining treatment. That book was a book by Gary Taubes, which in the UK is called The Diet Delusion, and in America it's called Good Calorie, Bad Calorie. And it was really that book that set me on my research into nutrition in detail. I came across some other books which also helped me get to where I am, one called Food and Western Disease by Professor Staffan Lindeberg, and then finding out about keto diets and how they're useful in treating epilepsy. And then I came across some researchers in Hungary, Sophia Clemens, who runs the Paleomedicina Clinic, and she advocates something called the paleo keto diet for her patients, which she's been using for 10 to 15 years now, actually, in more than 10,000 patients, very successfully. And the diet that we advocate in the book, which is called the Sapiens diet, is based on that, on the paleo keto diet. And we think it's the healthiest diet for people and also for the planet.
Yeah. Ali, do you want to
go? Yes, okay. So when I began work as an agricultural advisor, I was living in the east of England, which is our main crop growing area. And having studied agriculture, as general agriculture and livestock and everything, I found myself having to work with arable farming and give agronomic advice, and I was quite appalled really at the intensive continuous cropping and what that involves in terms of, particularly in terms of pesticides and the eradication of habitat and wildlife really, and only the livestock around the edges on the land that couldn't be cropped, suckler cows, beef cows, and sheep, seemed to be doing anything beneficial to help the environment and put things back a bit. But I believed all the advice that we've been given over the years, that we should all eat 5 a day in fruit and vegetables and more and more and more, and whole grains and all this sort of thing. And then my health began to deteriorate when I was about 40. I started gaining a lot of weight and couldn't do anything about that. And I started developing a few other health issues, like a skin complaint called rosacea. And then in, I think it was about 2020, I'd been looking into more stuff on diet and health, and started doing a ketogenic diet, but more of a kind of Mediterranean style ketogenic diet using olive oil and coconut oil and lots of fruit and vegetables, but with fish and I've always eaten meat, mainly beef and lamb, but you know what we're told is that we shouldn't. And my health, I started to lose weight, but then through my work, I met Anita, and we had a long chat, and I was very relieved to hear that actually we are completely carnivore animals, and it was perfectly okay just to eat meat and fat, which I've always loved eating fatty meat. So it was just a complete relief not to have to eat fruit that I didn't like, and overnight, I would say within the first 2 weeks, lots of different health issues started to resolve, including the skin issues. I continued to lose weight. Acid reflux disappeared. Within 2 years, I'd corrected, I'd developed Barrett's esophagus, damage to the cells of the esophagus as a result of acid reflux, and that resolved by the next time I had a checkup. So lots of benefits, and just in terms of mental health and everything, massive benefits. So completely convinced, and I haven't looked back.
And for me, yeah, a bit like Ali, I mean, until 3 years ago, I believe the food guidelines that we're told in the UK. Ali's mentioned some of them, you know, at least 5 a day of fruit and veg, eat lots of wholemeal grains, limit your consumption of red meat. And then Anita suggested, well, you know, it'd be better to cut out the grains, for example, which I did. So every morning, my typical breakfast was, you know, breakfast cereal with fruit and veg and maybe some honey and so on top. A typical lunch would always be wholemeal bread sandwiches, and an evening meal of meat and veg and so on. I cut out the grains, and although I didn't consider myself overweight, I lost, I would say, 2 or 3 inches around the waist. So gone down a size in my jeans, and just felt, you know, my gut health just felt so much better. And then likewise, you know, 5 a day, don't pay any attention to that now. And really, and like Ali said, really enjoy eating. I mean, the fantastic meat that we grow here, pasture raised meat, beef and lamb and so on, absolutely gorgeous.
Wow. Wow. Thank you for sharing that amazing journey. I love that. I was told at one point in my personal training career that we needed to tell our clients they needed to eat 9 to 11 servings of fruit and vegetables in a day. Forget 5. And I didn't even know anybody in the industry that could eat that many fruit and vegetables, let alone try to afford it and try to prepare it and try not to throw food away at the end of the week. And we were saying, like, it needs to be organic, and you need to have like the top soil, amazing soil to grow this stuff in, which we never questioned, like, well, where are you going to get good soil from? But it's interesting to consider those ideas, everything that you mentioned, the 5 a day and the fiber. These ideas are so ubiquitous. Everybody knows that you should do those things. Everybody knows that vegetables are healthy for you. You need fruit. You should eat fruit 365 days out of the year, even if it doesn't grow anywhere near you all year round. So where did some of these ideas originate? Are they part of our evolution, or are they something that somebody came up with arbitrarily that we just jumped on board with?
I guess, I mean, my opinion now, having, done this book and done the research, I think in my mind, it starts with rejecting fat. the idea of Ansel Keys and others, and then the way that influenced American food policy in the 1970s. If you reject fat because you believe wrongly that it's the root of heart disease and so on, and blocking up your arteries, once you reject fat, what are you going to do? And likewise, the meat that goes with that fat. So where are you going to get energy from? From carbohydrates. So that's where that came from. Where are you going to get your nutrients from? Well, I guess that's the 5 a day story. Or at least 5 a day, or as you say, even more than that. And if you count that up, if you say 7 portions of fruit and veg a day for an adult, as we say in the book, for a family of 4, that's 150 portions a week of fruit and veg, which our guidelines describe as being a great source of vitamins and nutrients. It seems to me that it's not a great source if you have to eat it 150 times a week for a family. It's quantity rather than quality. And then, of course, they throw in the fiber as well. So along with the myth about fat leading to heart disease, there's this idea that you need fiber to kind of keep your insides working and stop getting clogged up. And in fact, as we say in the book, it does the opposite. If anything, it clogs you up. It provides no nutritional value. But I think that the rot starts with ignoring evolution. No one seems to put that into these, into the context of these dietary studies. They ignore evolution, in which we thrived on a meaty, fatty diet. They ignore that, and then you go down this path of, well, what are you going to eat instead?
The underlying issue is that the guidelines are based on nutrition studies, which are seriously flawed. We cover that in a chapter called Science Fiction, which shows that the guidelines are based on epidemiological studies. So that's looking at a group of people, seeing what they eat and seeing what diseases they end up with. So you can show an association from those kinds of studies, but you can never prove a cause. And so the studies that they're based on are seriously flawed. And so as a result, the actual guidelines are incorrect too.
Wow. Well, that's such a good point. And if you really stop and think about it, it's so ridiculous. If you stop and think about it, what were the nutritional guidelines designed to do? They were designed to help reverse heart disease. What is the #1 killer in 2025 in America? I'm sure it's the same in the UK, of people in our country. It is still heart disease. The #1 killer. It's not like, oh, we fixed heart disease, but unfortunately now we have an obesity issue and we have a diabetes problem and mental health is going south, but at least we fixed the one thing. We didn't even fix the one thing that the nutritional guidelines were supposed to fix, and we have all these other problems. It's ludicrous.
Yeah, diabetes and being overweight and obese have roughly trebled since the food guidelines were put in place some 50 years ago.
And not to mention Alzheimer's disease.
Many people think that they're the cause of the rise in obesity and diabetes, but like any epidemiological study, you can't prove that.
Yeah, well said. I like you guys mentioned evolution. You guys kind of say something that I really like. You say that we kind of have a habit of saying, like, we evolved to eat meat. But you kind of phrase that a bit differently in the chapter where you talk about our evolution. Can you explain why you decided to reframe that a little bit?
Yeah, so we say we evolved because we ate meat rather than we evolved to eat meat. The anthropological evidence is really clear on that. Since we split from the chimpanzee line roughly 6 million years ago, which is when our hominin ancestors first started eating animal foods, it was eating brain and bone marrow, which they scavenged from kill sites, which supplied the essential nutrients needed for brain growth. And in that time, our brains have roughly trebled in size. As we say in the book, it's gone from the size of a split bread roll to the size of a small sourdough loaf, whereas the chimpanzee brain has stayed exactly the same. And there have been many other biological changes at the same time. Our guts have shrunk. Overall, the human gut has shrunk, but the small intestine has lengthened. It's the colon that's become much smaller. And the energy that was freed up by the change in the gut size could then power the growth of the brain. Because the human brain uses a lot of energy. It's only 2% of our body weight, but it uses up 20% of our energy. And so it's actually eating animal foods that triggered that change. And then as we became more intelligent, we became more skilled at obtaining animal foods, for example, using tools and hunting. And then you get a vicious circle.
Virtuous circle.
Virtuous circle developing, where you get better and better at accessing animal foods. And so your brain grows even more. But
yeah, go on.
sorry, surprisingly, in the last 10,000 years, since we took up agriculture and introduced grains and other foods that weren't in our diet pre-agriculture, our brains have shrunk in size by about 7%. Some say it could be the change in diet, the fact that we eat less animal food now, but yeah, we don't know for sure.
It's a really good point. Those anatomical changes are really important to point out to people. And I think of the many, like you said, there's so many of them. We could talk about, babies that are born, our brain size, our gut size, like you mentioned. But I'll even just point out, like, look at our shoulder joints. We don't hang in trees the way that our closest relatives do, but we can throw way better than they can.
Yeah.
And so what would that suggest? We don't need to hang out in trees. We don't need that vegetation, but we need to throw things. We have a hypermobile shoulder joint that allows us to be able to do that. And that's one of, again, many, many, many different anatomical changes that's really important to point out for people that aren't considering that.
Yep.
Some people say that we don't have the teeth of carnivorous animals, but what we say is that we didn't need the teeth of carnivorous animals because we developed tools. We can use knives and other implements to process our food, well, to cut it, which is a type of food processing.
Yeah, just like
And
Dr.
also
Bill
we've
Schindler
got,
says, it's sharp rock. If you have a sharp rock, you're good. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say that also, chimps and gorillas and other primates that are largely herbivorous or completely herbivorous often have really big canine teeth because it's not for catching and eating prey. It's for social use and shows of aggression and so on, dominance.
Yeah, that's a really good point. One of my favorite chapters, we've already mentioned it, of fiber, the idea that we need fiber in our diets. I love that chapter. Can you explain why not only that is not true, but why so many people might be benefited from removing fiber and not trying to just eat more fiber than they're already eating?
So we call that chapter Fiber, a Natural Junk Food, which is what it is. To start with, fiber isn't a nutrient that's necessary for humans. We can't digest it. We don't need it. Eating a high fiber diet can actually wash nutrients out of your body. It reduces the bioavailability of vitamins and minerals. And some studies have shown that it can also leach protein out of your diet. So you're losing micronutrients and macronutrients. Fiber causes bloating. It's unpleasant for the person eating the fiber, and it could be unpleasant even for others in the vicinity. There's
constipation.
Yeah, and then there's the whole idea that fiber helps constipation and fiber can reduce your risk of bowel cancer. Neither of those are true. The studies on which those are based are not good studies. They're epidemiological type studies. There are no controlled trials, which are good types of studies, which show that fiber is beneficial in reducing the risk of bowel cancer. Most of the big studies show either no benefit, a small benefit, or fiber can, in some studies, show that it's actually harmful. And then with the constipation idea, which is believed even by medical professionals that fiber aids constipation. There's been a really good study that was done in Singapore where they took a group of people and cut out fiber completely from their diet, and every single one of them had an improvement in bloating and constipation. What those researchers said, what they likened it to was a traffic jam. If you have a traffic jam, adding more cars will only make the situation worse. It's the same with constipation. If you have a bowel that's already packed with feces, adding more fiber is just going to make that worse.
Yeah, it's a really, really good point.
Also, if you look at the strict definition of constipation, many people think you need to go every day, but actually you don't. There are quite strict criteria for what actually constipation is, and frequency on its own isn't one of them.
Yeah, that's a question I get all the time. I just started a carnivore diet and I'm not going every day. What's wrong? It's like, well, probably nothing's wrong. I don't know if you guys watched this video. This kind of went viral last year. This woman, bless her heart, wrote a book about all the benefits of fiber. And she posted a video of after a meal, since her and her husband eat such a high fiber diet, they go on fart walks. She created the hashtag fart walks, and they go walk around for 15, 20 minutes and get all their flatulence out for the time being. And that's a practice that they do and promote. And this is the wonderful thing about fiber. And you should go out and get your steps and get rid of all your gas. Like, really? Like, is it that good for us if that's what you have to do after every meal? That doesn't sound very pleasant to me.
Yeah.
And actually, Sean Baker also put it well. He said, you're just making expensive poop.
Great point. Yeah, that's a really, really good point. I love that. Anybody can go and Google this. Go Google who is a low fiber diet recommended for. And sure enough, there will be a list of 5 to 10 different digestive issues that people have where a low fiber diet is recommended. IBS, IBD, diverticulitis, Crohn's disease, leaky gut. Like, there's so many conditions where we should be recommending a low fiber diet for, yet people think they need more to help with those conditions when actually it's truly making it worse.
Yeah, you hear stories. I mean, we have a friend who, suffers bouts of, irritable bowel and so on. And the doctor's advice is then, well, reduce the amount of fiber. But then when those symptoms have gone, it's, well, now eat fiber again. And it doesn't seem to make the link that, well, maybe just don't eat it at all.
And like you mentioned in ulcerative colitis, it's like absolutely clear that when you have a flare-up of the disease, you should cut out fiber completely if you can. And yet when you go back into remission, you're told to go back to eating fiber. It doesn't make sense.
It should just be common sense. That should just be a very commonsensical thing. You write about a lot of different topics, obviously, in the book, but one of the ones that you cover really, really well is fats. We've already mentioned fat as part of the diet. It's something that has been identified as harmful, and we tried to reduce the amount of fat in our diets or change the fats we've been eating for very poor reasons without really, really good results anyway. But can you talk about the different kinds of fats, the difference between animal fats and plant fats?
One of the main differences is the amounts of saturated and unsaturated fat. In beef fat, roughly half the fat is saturated fat. Roughly 48% is monounsaturated fat, and if it's grass-fed, 2% is omega fats and roughly equal amounts of omega-3 and omega-6. Whereas plant fats, the vegetable oils that people commonly consume aren't made from vegetables for a start. They're seed oils mostly, and they have a much higher amount of omega fats, or polyunsaturated fats, as they're also known. And in particular, the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 is much higher in plant fats, in plant fat oils. Those are the main differences. And what we say is that we didn't evolve to eat seed oils. We evolved eating animal fats, that those have the right ratios of the fats that we need.
Yeah,
It
so
is
vegetables have been
Go ahead.
around about, what, 100
100
years?
years.
100 years?
They're
So,
the ultimate ultra-processed food.
yeah.
You need an industrial plant to make them. They don't even come from vegetables. We didn't evolve with them. They're the wrong types and ratios of fats. And historically, some vegetable oils have been used to induce cancer in animals. Why would we want to eat them?
Yeah, great point. This is the most tagged video we have on our show. I tag it every few episodes, but the How It's Made episode, it was a show that shows how different processes are made, the How It's Made canola oil. If you can watch that and you still want to put this stuff in your body, go for it. It is absolutely disgusting what they have to do. You do require many industrial processes, many different steps in factories to be able to create this stuff. And yeah, if you can watch that video and think that this is like good and healthy to put in your body, knock yourself out. But I certainly would not get anywhere near this stuff. We also know that there are fruit fats as well. So we talk about the benefits of potentially coconut oil and olive oil. Can you share your thoughts around this? I find this to be also a little bit controversial.
So olive oil, even though it's better than the other seed oils, it's still very high in omega-6 fat. It's still got roughly 13 times the amount of omega-6 fats that beef fat has. So I would say that it's still not the best fat. Coconut oil is mostly saturated fat. It has virtually no omega fats at all. But according to the researchers in Hungary, they think that coconut oil is still a problem with causing leaky gut.
Interesting. So where possible, just stick with animal fats to do your cooking.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I agree. People give a free pass to olive oil all the time. And I wonder, I don't think you can find really good high quality olive oil and know that it's not cut with other seed oils, for example. And yeah, I've heard of evidence that, like, yes, we've cultivated olives for use in oil, but it was mostly like topical applications, not necessarily something we would consume in high amounts, and certainly not something that would even be available on every part of the planet, just very limited locations. So
it was also used a lot for burning in lamps. It was the main way of lighting your home and things, and so a lot of it would have been used for that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Ali, I want to turn to you because I believe you guys are both on my phone and you're very small on Zoom, but I believe Over Your Shoulder is one of my favorite books. Is that the Great Plant-Based Con?
Yes, that's right. Jane Buxton's
such
book.
A sweetheart, Jane Buxton. She's amazing. She's such a good writer. One thing she does really well in her book, you guys do as well in your book, where there's a chapter that is all the harms of thinking that the meat is bad for us. Then there's a chapter on all the ways that meat is good for us and all the benefits we gain from it. And there's another chapter about all the ways that plants can actually harm us. So if we flip the conversation a little bit and say, like, can you tell us about why eating animals, eating meat is so good for us? And will we have any kind of nutrition deficiencies if we eat only meat and we avoid all plants?
If we eat only meat, we won't have any nutrition deficiencies. But ideally, you should include some organ meat, or offal, as it's also known, because offal is one of the most nutrient-dense foods. It contains every single vitamin, mineral, and fat that we need. Whereas the same cannot be said for a plant-based diet. Yeah. Especially, vitamin B12 isn't found in any plant foods. Certain fats such as DHA you can't get from plant foods, and minerals such as iron. It's the bioavailable form of iron, heme iron, that's present in animal foods, so it's easier to absorb and use. Whereas plant foods contain non-heme iron. And then there's the whole issue of things like zinc. Even though it is present in some plant foods, there are so many anti-nutrients in plant foods that inhibit or slow down the absorption of zinc, that you're just better off getting it from animal foods.
You mentioned earlier about, in the UK, the guidelines, they're called the Eat Well guidelines. And I've already said, if you go to the fruit and vegetable page of those guidelines online, it says fruit and veg are a good source of vitamins and nutrients. You now go to another page on the same guidelines. This is the advice page for vegans. And about halfway down that page, it says, for a healthy vegan diet, for which read, because a vegan diet is unhealthy, but it says for a healthy vegan diet, have fortified foods and supplements to provide the vitamins and nutrients that are missing, hard to obtain on a plant-based vegan diet. And it lists some of them: vitamin B12, as we've already said, vitamin D, selenium, iodine, calcium, and bioavailable iron. So you've got this contradiction. On one page it says they're good. On another page it says, well, actually some are missing, or some are not easily digested. They label supermarket carrots in the United Kingdom, so the Eat Well logo of the food guidelines, and it says rich in vitamin A. There's no vitamin A in carrots. There's beta carotene, but beta carotene is poorly bioavailable. It's not easily digested, especially in the absence of fat. And the guidelines, of course, the official guidelines are low-fat guidelines. So you're not getting the benefit of the beta-carotene either. So they're either missing, not bioavailable, or as Anita just said, you've got other things, phytates, oxalates and lectins and so on, these antivitamins that plants have because they don't really want to be eaten. So they try and make themselves come across less nutritious by inhibiting the uptake of these vitamins and nutrients. So for 3 reasons, you can't say that eating plants is a good idea.
Such a good point. Wow, I love that. You guys made such a good point earlier, how intertwined planetary health is with human health and how we can talk about both these things. I do think it's helpful the way you guys separate those out, very similar again to the way that Jane Reese Buxton did in her book, The Great Plant-Based Con, is we have to talk about human nutrition over here, and let's not get that confused with planetary nutrition, although they run together. And let's do start a bit on the defense. Again, it's so ubiquitous out there. Everybody knows the stories that they hear about greenhouse gases and cows and their burps and farts, and we're heating up the planet, and it's all because of animal agriculture, and that is what is driving climate change. Again, to me, this is just common damn sense, and you should go look at a freeway or an airport to see where most of our emissions are coming from. But can we start a little bit on the defense about why animal agriculture and raising cattle in particular is not nearly the problem that it's been told to us that it is?
Yeah, sure. So the story about methane that we're told is that cows produce methane. A lot of people say that cows fart a lot and produce methane that way, but that's not true. They burp out the methane from the rumen, because the rumen is the first stomach. A cow has, and other ruminants have 4. Produce methane and they burp it out into the air. Yes, that's true. But that's as far as the story goes, as far as all that we hear from the media, and basically what the IPCC cover, and the Food and Agriculture Organization, and all those kind of organizations that talk about this. But it's not just about emission, because this methane is part of the biogenic carbon cycle. So what happens is that cows eat grass, obviously, or grass and plants in their natural habitat. We're advocating pasture-reared meat from cattle and sheep that are grazing outside, not indoors, grain-fed mainly. So grass, as we know, we learn in school, does something called photosynthesis, as other plants do, and it takes carbon dioxide out of the air to turn that into carbohydrate. of different forms, including cellulose, the fiber that we're talking about, and sugars and starches. The cattle or sheep are grazing that, and they're eating that carbohydrate. So they're eating the carbon that came out of the air, and they turn it into their body tissues, and they also poop it out in cow dung or sheep dung, and they produce some of it gets turned into methane, because methane is a mixture of carbon and hydrogen. So just some of that that's been taken out of the air gets released back into the air as methane, and that methane breaks back down quite quickly back to carbon dioxide, and then it gets taken out of the air again by the plants. So it's just a cycle. The cattle are not adding any extra carbon to the air, either as methane or as carbon dioxide. And what's actually happening is that it's a beneficial cycle, because not all the carbon goes back into the air. The cattle are putting some of it into their body tissues. The plants in the grassland are also secreting sugars into the soil through their roots. So some of the carbon's going that way, and that's why grassland soils are high carbon, high organic matter. And also the animals that are grazing are dunging, pooping on the grassland, and those cow pats are rapidly taken down underground by dung beetles and other creatures, and incorporated into the soil as more organic matter. So this whole system just sequesters carbon out of the atmosphere into the soil. And soil is the safest place for carbon to be, or at least, some of that carbon to be. Grassland soils are really good at that, and they're really important for this. When we plough up land and put it into arable crops, the soil is very exposed to the air for a lot of the time. It's often bare over winter until you plant, although we often tell farmers to plant a cover crop these days to protect the soil to some extent. And also there's big gaps between the arable plants, because the arable plants are nearly all annual plants that you have to sow every year. And they grow from being very small seedlings until eventually they cover the soil surface. But what's happening if you're ploughing the land or tilling the land in any way and planting crops every year, the soil is exposed to the air an awful lot, and what's happening is that the air is oxidizing the carbon from the soil, the organic matter from the soil, and turning it into carbon dioxide and emitting it into the atmosphere. So, as we say in the book, there's a lot of evidence and studies that show that over the time that we've been farming, about a third of the carbon that's been added to the atmosphere actually comes from soil damage. And most of that soil damage is being caused by arable cropping. Some other causes as well, sometimes by animal production when you're doing damage with poor grazing management. But most of it's coming from arable farming and the exposure of the soil to the air. So actually, it's really harmful. And just to say that traditionally, 100 years or so ago, we always knew that, farmers knew it, everyone understood that growing crops is damaging to the soil, and you're losing organic matter from the soil, you're losing fertility. And you need to put that fertility back in some way. And the way that you do that is with grass and grazing animals through the cow dung and the grass itself. So traditionally, we always used to rotate arable crops with grassland and grazing animals. And we stopped doing that within the last century, since we developed agrochemicals, fertilizers, and pesticides, and it became more convenient to rip out all the hedges and just have continuous cropping, big machinery. Fossil fuels obviously made that possible. And so we've removed the livestock and the grass from many of our arable areas. And that's why we're doing so much damage in the last 100 years or so.
Yeah,
So you get
that's
the
such a good point.
situation, Casey, where
Mhm.
certainly in the UK, you get the media, as Ali's described, you've got this cycle, the biogenic cycle. They only talk about the emissions, which completely misrepresents what's going on in livestock farming. And then there's no discussion, virtually no discussion about the alternative, if you're not going to do livestock farming, is more, the agriculture farming. And again, as Ali's described, that's the villain that's releasing carbon dioxide, that's destroying soils, destroying ecosystems, and is killing more animals as a result.
Yeah.
So complete nonsense.
Well, yeah, I mean, you hear the ridiculous numbers about water usage and, that they count rainwater and they don't count the water that the cow is putting back on land. Your argument, which I really love, again, is not that cows are not as bad as we think for the environment, but we actually need ruminants. We need a lot more ruminants to reverse climate change. They're the ones that are going to help us out of this mess that we've gotten into. They're the positive ones. And I'm telling you guys, you do this better than anybody I've ever read. When you go on the offensive on the agriculture, Dave, what you were just kind of alluding to, that agriculture is far worse than I think a lot of people think about. That I don't think that got brought up in the debate that I just listened to, because we're always, again, on the defensive and trying to justify raising cows as being not as bad, but we don't ever go on the attack and talk about how bad agriculture truly is. So can we go into a little bit more detail about the things
that
three of you have learned about that?
One of Ali's chapters we called Wheat is Murder. Obviously a play on the old one, Meat is Murder, but Wheat is Murder. So the idea, I mean, a lot of the feedback we've had on the book online from vegans is about the nutrition, and they disagree, wrongly, of course, but we actually point out, but actually it's not just about the nutrition side that vegan is deficient in. The whole point of it was meant to be to save animals. That's why probably most people pick up on a vegan diet rather than just a vegetarian diet, for example. They think it's being kind to animals. But you look at crop farming, and we look at all the ways in which animals are culled to stop them damaging crops, to stop them damaging the monocultures that we're growing, the use of pesticides, insecticides, and so on that kills trillions of insects, the whole, the base of the food chain. And that has an impact, of course, on those animals that rely on that food chain to eat. Birds are shot in millions in this country, again, always to protect growing crops. So it's not vegan to eat plants. You're actually probably killing more animals as a result than you are saving.
In a less
We say there's no such thing as a vegan diet.
Yeah.
Because the number of animals that you're having to kill is vastly more than the number of animals that you need to kill if you want to eat beef. Because a cow is a large animal, and you can feed a human for about 2 years from a cow's, and you can eat virtually everything apart from perhaps the bones, but. And one of the criminal things is how much we waste of these animals, and particularly in terms of the fat, because of this fear of fat that has been this message that we've been given. And in this country, we've changed our beef cattle breeds over the last 40 years or so, and we've imported a lot of European breeds. And replaced our native breeds. I mean, in the States, you're familiar with the British native breeds like the Hereford, the Aberdeen Angus. These are great cattle, but they're slower growing and they get fatter earlier than the European breeds like the Charolais or the Limousin. And when animals are slaughtered, they have to meet a fatness level that's accepted, but and a lot of the fat is trimmed off and wasted, or maybe goes into pet feed or something. And so, you know, we're getting a steak that has very little fat on it when you buy it in the shops and so on, when it's really important to eat that fat. So these are some of the harms that have been done by this story. In this country, we shoot millions and millions of birds to protect crops. We shoot lots and lots of rabbits, hares. Most of the bird species that we're shooting are protected, but farmers are allowed licenses to shoot them. Lots of deer are being shot. 350,000 deer are culled in this country every year, largely to protect crops like wheat and so on, but also to protect woodland and so on, because they do quite a lot of damage and they don't have any predators in this country. And then, as Dave was saying about the trillions and quadrillions of insects and earthworms and everything else that we are decimating. You know, everybody knows that in the last few decades, you know, when I was growing up, you know, if you went on holiday in the summer, your windscreen was just covered in insects. That doesn't happen anymore. And there are good, very good studies showing that that anecdote is not just an anecdote. So there was a German study in 2017. It was a 27-year study that showed an 80% decline in flying insects. It was a shocking landmark study. And then Rothamsted Research Institute in this country, it's one of the world's most renowned agricultural research institute, 30-year studies showing the same things in sites all over Britain. And this is all coming mainly from pesticides and from habitat destruction. And what many people don't understand is that, you know, a lot of people know these ideas about killing of insects and how bad pesticides are, but what they don't put together is it's arable agriculture, crop agriculture, that uses all these pesticides. In this country, we've got very good data on pesticide usage. 99% is used in arable agriculture, on arable land, every year. So for an average wheat crop in Britain, you'll be spraying with 20 different active ingredients, pesticides, herbicides, every single year. And the soil is being drenched in that, the crops are being drenched in that. And things like glyphosate are being sprayed just before harvest to desiccate the crop. So, you know, in terms of human health, this is very, very questionable, I would say. So, and there are interactions between all these different kinds of pesticides. So it's not just the insecticides that are doing the damage to the insect population, it's the herbicides and everything else too. And they interact and they exacerbate the problems and the killing of animals.
Wow.
And of course,
It's
as Dave said, I was just going to say it's an ecosystem issue, because if you're wiping out the small creatures at the bottom of the food chain, it knocks on all the way up. And we quote Rachel Carson, you know, the American author from the 1960s who wrote Silent Spring. And she warned us, and we've never really learned that lesson.
Wow. One of the things that really stood with me is talking with Leah Keith. Obviously, you guys will know as the author of The Vegetarian Myth. And she described what it's like to drive a combine. It can be quite traumatic for the combine driver who's harvesting the crops, and it's condensing as they go. So they say the last acre is always the worst, because all the animals who had made that their habitat are all rushing for their lives to the same area where they're all getting killed at the same time. And that is only after you've already eliminated all the other plants. You planted one crop. Very important to say, like you said, an annual plant versus a perennial plant. Those two plants have very different life goals and missions, and it's just killing our soil. And I love that you mentioned that last point, which is Lierre always had to decide where she was going to draw the line between what is sentient and what she could not care about dying when she was getting her food and what was not sentient. And we don't think about things like insects and bees and earthworms. And I had never considered the thing about the windshield driving in the summertime hitting bugs. You're right. Like, I can't remember the last time I needed to get a car wash when I drove across the countryside, and that used to happen all the time. So I think it's really important to say that the smaller animals, just because you can't see their faces doesn't mean that they don't matter in huge amounts. It's all part of that cycle. And once Lierre Keith learned what we all know now, is that line is not a line, it's a circle. It goes around, and all of us are participating in life and death, and we all have responsibility there. There's blood on all of our hands.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
You do such a good job writing about that.
Ali put it very well in one of her chapters that, you know, we are part of this planet. We have to grow food of one type or another. And the idea that we can grow that food without killing something is just crazy. We just have to be able to do it in a way that is sustainable. And of course, when it comes to slaughtering, cows and sheep and so on, that it's done in a humane way. But it's not done in a humane way at all in arable agriculture.
Especially the poison many rodents. Oh, sorry, I was just going to say about that. It's not just the animals that are being shot. In fact, that's probably the best part of it, because, for instance, the shooting of deer, red deer in Scotland, it will be, the people will be well trained marksmen. Ordinary farmers with shotguns, not so much. But it's the poisoning of lots and lots of rodents, huge numbers of rodents, and for protecting grain stores and all sorts of things, and trapping, snaring of rabbits, and chasing of, shooting of hares, and chasing them with dogs, and the shooting of millions of birds. So yeah, it's a brutal way to kill an animal and create your food.
Yeah, it really is.
I was just going to say that the way cows are killed is very humane. They're stunned, they feel no pain. Whereas if you get churned up in a combine harvester, that's awful.
Yeah, and all the stress that goes before that as well. Yeah. Well, okay,
exactly.
There's another part of your book that I really love that you included this. You could have written the book and left this out, but you decided to include it, and I'm so glad you did. I get questions about this all the time. One of your appendices mentions practical, simple tips for following what you guys are calling a sapien diet. And you list off it's a few pages. It's not a lot. It's not complicated recipes. It's just some really great ideas of practical ways to get this food in there. So I'm so glad you included that. You again, it's very simple. It's easy to understand. Any human can say, oh, I could probably do some of this, even if you have very few skills in the kitchen. Why did you want to make sure that you included at least a bit of a practical guide of how you can incorporate some of these meals into your day-to-day?
It's one of the first questions that people have. So what am I going to eat? And it's actually very easy. So for example, breakfast can be bacon and eggs. Well, we include a little bit of liver as well. And if you eat this way, you usually are fine with just 2 meals a day, a sort of brunch and then an early evening meal. And it's just meat or fish or eggs cooked so many different ways. It's quick, easy. You don't have to spend loads of time peeling and chopping vegetables. You save time. It's just so much simpler, and there's a huge choice.
And the idea that it doesn't have to be bland. It's not, you can spice up your meats, you can spice up the liver, make it very palatable, very tasty. So it's delicious.
And previously one might have had, say, just cereal for breakfast every day. That's monotonous too. What's wrong with having a similar breakfast every day if it's bacon and eggs or salmon or whatever?
All other animals eat a monotonous diet very happily, because in the wild that's what they're suited to eating. And our pet dogs and cats that we think need as much variety as we do suffer the same diseases that we do as a result. And it's just so satisfying, and you don't have this. Before I discovered the diet, I just thought about food all day long. When was I next going to be able to eat? And how could I limit the amount that I was going to eat? But eating a high fat and animal protein diet just makes you feel satisfied all the time.
Yeah, I definitely feel like I'm in my natural environment when I'm eating I'm a carnivore diet now for about 6 years, and I don't ever get sick of steak and eggs. So go ahead, Anita.
Yeah.
Yeah, the other thing is that when you say 70% of your diet should be animal fat, people think, oh my God, there's going to be solid pieces of fat on my plate. But no, it's actually in the meat that you're eating. And if you cook the meat in animal fat as well, it's quite easy to get that ratio right.
Yeah.
Can I just add in, talking about what we eat? As we say in the book, the kinds of meat that we're eating, we tend to prefer to eat pasture-reared meat. So that's mainly beef and lamb, or it could be goat or venison, or but rather than animals that are reared on grains. So I don't eat any chicken, very, very rarely anyway, because almost all the chicken in this country and most industrialized countries are reared on grains, and there are significant welfare issues. This is why the plant-based people, this is what they criticize all the time. They're always looking at grain-fed animals, which are reared indoors and so on. And we agree that the welfare is an issue in those situations. And the grain feeding isn't good in terms of the environment. So as much as possible, we would eat pasture-reared meat like beef, lamb, and so on.
Great point.
So we have a hierarchy at the back of the book of foods that are good for your health and for the health of the planet. And top of the list is pasture-reared beef and lamb. It's good for both the planet and for people.
I've never seen it put the way that you guys put it on that hierarchy, and it's really well done. So I appreciate that you made that point. And I also appreciate that you guys are approaching this topic in a similar way that I am. I personally am not a huge fan when carnivores pick on people like vegans or pick on people who choose to do plant-based diets or make fun of them. I see that every now and again. It's not always, it doesn't even seem to be the majority, but sometimes, like I've seen, some of the rebuttals against like the game changers, where they're like making fun of the people in the game changers. I'm not really for that. I'm here, like you guys, to educate people who want to follow ketogenic or carnivore diets. I'm not here to pick on vegans. If I say oftentimes that if I'm basically working at a Ford dealership, and if you want a Ford, I'm probably a pretty good person to talk to. If you want to buy a Chevy, yeah, I can tell you about cars, but I can't really help you buy a Chevy. You can go to the Chevy dealership, and that's kind of the way I think about this. And so, as you have probably lots of experience with, as of now, having conversations, how would you recommend that most of us that are a little bit more on the pro keto, pro carnivore side have conversations with people who are vegans, and do it in a way that is respectful and mindful and can maybe help move the needle for somebody who is open-minded?
I'd say most people are misinformed, and they don't have to dig very deep to get to the truth. It's there for everyone to see that a plant-based diet causes more animal death and suffering. It's worse for the planet, and it's worse for your health.
It is difficult though, Casey, because people make a decision about the diet they want to eat. It becomes a very personal thing to them, part of either their individual identity or their families or their social group, even their country. And it's a great question. I'm not sure I've got a great answer. How do you convince someone who is trying to make their mind up? Because the majority of what they will read and see is saying the opposite, that, you know, limit meat, eat more plants. You see that all the time. It has to be a very subtle, and it's not going to be, I don't think it's going to be an instant conversion. It's going to be, keep it gentle, keep it respectful, as you say, but keep chipping away and introduce a new fact every time, not just on the nutrition side, but also on the farming side. But it is a great question, and I don't have an easy answer.
I have a friend who was vegetarian for 20 years, and after hearing what I've been saying for the last few years, she's gone the opposite now, and she
was that overnight, or
it wasn't overnight,
okay.
but it doesn't have to be, you know.
Okay.
She's eventually come around to our way of thinking.
Well, there's one good example.
I think, oh, sorry. I think that if we say to people, have an open mind, read the book, read the other books like Sacred Cow, The Great Plant-Based Con, and so many more books out there on nutrition and farming, and read the book and do so with an open mind and listen to the evidence that we and others are putting forward, and then give it a try and see if you feel better, which I'm sure you will.
I really appreciate each of those very thoughtful answers. Yeah, at the end of the day, it's, you know, you're right. It's not really our job to convince anybody of anything, but just to be able to present the facts in a way that you guys present. You mentioned all those other wonderful books and resources, and I love that all of the authors that we love have a different angle and a different way of presenting this information. You certainly have done that in an amazing way in your book. And so I really appreciate the three of you and the amazing work you've done. Dave, Anita, Alison, the three of you, where would you like people to go to find you and connect with you in your work?
The book's available on Amazon.
And we have a website, whyveganshavesmallerbrains.com. And
we're on Instagram.
Instagram and Twitter, which we're
Facebook and so yeah.
Excellent. Cool. Yeah, we'll link all of that stuff up.
They'll find us.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll make that the main resource, and we'll link all the others as well, so that people can find the book and purchase the book. And again, I believe that you guys are some of the best at presenting this information in a way that's easy to understand and is very thought-provoking. It starts with that title, but there's so much substance in the book to back it up. And I just love the way you present the arguments and in a very simple and logical way. So thank you so very much for all the work that went into writing the book. Thank you for putting it out there, even down to choosing such a provocative title. And thank you so very much for taking time out of your busy day to appear on our show today. We really appreciate all of you.
Thanks very much.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
Of course. It's such an honor. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.